welcome to the opencomm Roundtable. This is a roundtable session in which we will discuss how communication scholarship could and should change in the new decade. As we say in Germany, even if you're in the UK like I am, erstens kommt es anders und zweitens als man denkt. Things tend to turn out differently than you'd think, because it is not in fact 11 a.m. on Friday, May 22nd, and we're not in fact in the convention center in room G, arena 1B on the Gold Coast in Australia. But instead, I'm greeting you from Leeds, United Kingdom, with a beautiful Yorkshire drizzle in the background here. And our panelists are sitting in Germany and the US respectively. So my name is Eike Mark Rinke. I'm the conference theme chair for this year's open communication theme at the annual ICA conference. I want to briefly introduce all of our sort of viewers to our 7 panelists here. So we do have here in alphabetical order, Lindsay Beer from the University of Southern California, Nick Bowman from Texas Tech University, Tobias Dean-Lien from the University of Hohenheim, soon to be University of Vienna, if I've understood that correctly, Jake Fisher from the University of California in Santa Barbara, Lance Holbert, editor of the JOC and at Temple University, Richard Husky from the University of California, Davis, and Renvan Elisang from Northwestern University. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to all of our anonymous viewers. So I would like to say a few words about the theme program, Open Communication, first, before we jump into this Q&A roundtable session here. So as conference theme chair, I'd like to use this, this introduction here to say a few words about why we're coming together here at all. So the goal of this theme program this year, put together by conference chair Claes de Frese and myself, was to bring a conversation to the field of communication about open science and open scholarship more broadly conceived, and openness. So thinking about openness in a broad way and how it could benefit or actually be a challenge to the field of communication. And we understood here openness in terms of transparency, in terms of collaboration amongst scholars, and in terms of openness as a focus on the creation of public goods, right? So these are the 3 key dimensions of openness we're interested in throughout the theme program. So the program will consist of 10 full-length sessions, which you can check out on the conference platform if you're already here, plus an opening plenary that's also sort of revolving around the topic, and an extra blue sky workshop on the future of open access publishing and communication, which is sort of happening on top. So this the theme program will encompasses 22 papers, and no fewer than 103 ICA scholars who contribute something actively to the program, either as co-author or as presenter or as session chair or as discussant. I think this is a significant number for me because really it shows me as the organizer that we do have a significant number of people in the field already who are interested in this discussion and actively promoting this conversation about openness in communication, right? So in some ways, I do think that 2020 is sort of a watershed moment, I think, for the field when it comes to sort of us opening ourselves towards the open science movement that's transdisciplinary in nature, of course. So today, this opencomm roundtable, which you're watching right now, is conceived as sort of a kick-off session for the entire theme program. And in the following half hour or so, we will discuss how communication scholarship could and should change in the new decade, as I just mentioned earlier. All of the panelists here are either co-authors of a recently published article called The Agenda for Open Science and Communication, was recently published as an advanced article in the Journal of Communication, of which Lance Holbert is the editor-in-chief, who's also joining us today. So the agenda is available open access. So if you're watching this and you haven't checked it out yet, I encourage you to do it right after having watched this video or before you continue doing so. And yeah, like I said, in the next 35 minutes, we will have a Q&A discussion, which sort of follows up on a series of short interviews, which each of the panelists has produced with brief responses to the agenda or additions to the agenda from specific perspectives of early career researchers, qualitative researchers, emerging fields of communication research methods, and of course, in Lance Holbert's case, of JOC as the leading journal in our field. So I encourage you to check out these videos as well, which should be linked in this session as well, but will all be made available open access as well in the spirit of open science. So this video here, we will discuss a set of questions around open science and communication that have been handed in by the communication community, and which also in part have been written up by our dear colleagues Diana Rieger and Anna-Sophie Kümpel, I understand. So big shout out to Munich here. Yes, we will take 30 to 35 minutes. At least that was the original plan. I don't know how unhinged we will become given our virtual setting now, but we'll try to keep within the time limit as planned as much as possible. And also with that rather lengthy prelude, I'll say, let's jump right in. I'll moderate this, and we'll see how the discussion flows and where the conversation takes us, essentially. So I will try to start this conversation amongst all of us with a rather, well, maybe down-to-earth question that was posed, and that's the question directly related to the agenda, and that's just, how was it possible to write a paper with more than 30 authors? Is one of the questions that we were asked. Maybe that's best answered, well, actually by all of us, but maybe Tobias can start with that because he organized the effort mostly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was a special project, that's for sure, that I can say. And it was only possible because we worked together in an online document, a Google document, where at times, I don't know, 10 people were writing at the same time. And yeah, but it was a coordinated effort. So there were a group of people the core team who did most of the writing, and a lot of the other co-authors, they discussed what was written already. And there were like lengthy conversations in the comments that were sometimes individual papers, it seemed, and yeah, it was a fascinating process, and it was also very interesting from a democratic perspective. Like, at which position do we say who wins? So there were some tough calls, and it was, of course, I mean, like, you could always opt for the easy option and leave controversial points out, but then in the end, you have nothing to say. And so there was always a little bit of, there was some debate, but I think no one is, I think everyone would have changed one or two little bits, but overall, I think the entire agenda is supported by everyone, and it was like a hugely encouraging process, and yeah, very special for me.
How did the others sort of perceive the collaborative process, which of course is was an exercise in open science in and of itself already?
There was a lot of time where we had to be insanely critical of each other, of our ideas, because, and I hope people realize when they read this manuscript that there were 36+ ideas shared in there. I mean, the agenda itself was quite long in the beginning, and we had to debate and argue. In some ways, I think it was the very core of academia. I mean, we had to come up with arguments and counter argue, and many of us found ourselves taking on positions that we didn't even necessarily agree with, but to try to deconstruct what the arguments are going to be in the end. And so, you know, I think it's important that when people read this manuscript, they realize that this wasn't just a small group of comm scholars who had sort of a already established view and they were, preaching the gospel, right? It was very much the opposite. We went out and got dozens of people who did not agree on this, and we very much hashed it out in those comments and in those conversations. A big part of my role was telling people no a lot, as was Tobias, because as they got towards the end, the paper went 30 pages, 40 pages, 50 pages, and then there was a lot of recollapsing. And it was one of the more exciting times, I think, of my career personally, where I got to know my colleagues at a deeply intellectual level. And so I hope when people read this, we didn't answer all the questions, but we certainly asked a lot of them in the call. Tobias and everybody else, it's probably one of those things where those scraps of paper would be a really interesting thing to share if we ever could, right? If they weren't so ephemeral. But it was truly collaborative. It was a lot of conversation. It was an insane amount of debate, and I hope when people read the agenda, they are able to recognize that this was not a predetermined outcome, that the agenda really did arise from the debates, rather than we just came to the agenda and shared it with everybody else.
Would any of you consider doing a similar sort of project again, like adopting that particular process of writing up the manuscript for your own work, crowdsourcing your manuscript, so to speak? Or is this a one-off for all of you? Well, I see Nick chuckling like it was.
If you have time, yeah. I mean, it was a lot of fun, but it is a lot of time and patience. But in some ways, that is how you are able to correct your own ideas. So I think in a perfect world, I might even go so far as to say that many of them would be like this. A lot of us sort of have our invisible channels where we talk to each other about papers we're working on. And in some ways, that's what this became, except that with 36 people, we didn't know each other. So I was really fascinated with how politely unhinged it became, to where it really was people pushing each other and not just, confirming each other because we're friends. It was purely academic. So would I do it again? I think I would. I don't know if I'd take the leap next time. I may go from third author to 36th for the next one, but I would love to see more of us do these things. I'll say that for sure.
So for me, this is the fourth big multi-author paper I've participated in. I've taken the lead on two that had, I think, a dozen authors on them, so certainly smaller than this one. And then I'm currently playing more of a backseat role in a paper that's actually a stage one revised or stage one accepted paper at Nature Human Behavior, where we're working with the Psych Sciences Accelerator to do a big multinational replication of a finding. And that paper has, I think, 120 authors on it. And I just, much like this paper in JOC, the amount of discussion in the just drafting the paper and drafting response letters to editor or responses to reviewers is an order of magnitude more than actually what ultimately gets published, So in terms of just the contribution and involvement of individual authors in a project like this, the amount of discussion that you don't see in the final product is pretty massive, I'd say.
Okay, so going from the process of actually producing the thing to the more sort of abstract and sort of substantive issues the agenda tries to tackle. I do have a question, maybe first for Lindsay, but then for everyone else. As watchers of this video should appreciate, Lindsay also recorded a video in which she responds to the agenda from a qualitative mixed methods approach perspective. There are a lot of questions around open science and its applicability beyond narrowly media psychology perspectives, and also particularly for qualitative methodologies. So the question here then is for you, Lindsay, maybe, whether you think that open science is more difficult, something more difficult to adopt and to practice for non-quantitative studies, and whether our move towards open science and embracing it and so on sort of carries with it a danger of disadvantaging these kinds of methodologies. Do you have any thoughts on this sort of widespread skepticism? Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you for this question. In short, no, I don't think that this disadvantages qualitative research. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. It affords qualitative researchers an opportunity to showcase what many of us have been doing for quite some time. And so I really appreciated Lance's comments about how this is an opportunity for us to discuss what are the gains and losses from adopting open science policies and practices. And as I thought about that through a qualitative research lens, I think that we have a huge opportunity to make gains through accessibility and transparency in our qualitative research practices. And so for a long time, it seems that qualitative research has been struggling for legitimacy in the communication field as well as in other fields. And so I think open science practices can help us illustrate the value of qualitative research, and it can help show that we are doing systematic, rigorous, qualitative practices through things like triangulation, through things like member checks, and providing chains of evidence and pattern matching. And so especially establishing transparency through sharing our study designs, sharing our data, while of course protecting the identities of our participants and withholding information that could be problematic from a confidentiality standpoint. Of course, we have to discuss more about how we prevent those types of losses, because we have to protect our participants' identities and information. But I think in the long term, this overall is beneficial for qualitative research, because many of us already have these practices in place, but we don't always talk about it. We don't always share this information, sometimes because there is limited words and pages that we can have when we submit an article to a journal. So sometimes we can't always disclose all of the rigor that we have in qualitative research in an article, but many of us have already been practicing these types of rigorous, systematic qualitative research through an interpretive lens, through a constructivist lens. And so through open science, now we can have more of a platform to share these practices, to discuss them, and that will lead to greater transparency. So while, of course, we have challenges in qualitative research, especially through protecting our participants, I think for the most part, this is a gain for qualitative research.
Thank you. So I guess this question about specific challenges for qualitative researchers feeds directly into the broader question about just how applicable open science in general is to communication as a field in general, right? So we did get the question that based on that there's a perception around open science as being particularly driven by psychologists, right? So this is this being something that's sort of spilling over from the field of psychology into communication research. It's mostly being promoted by people who would see themselves as media psychologists, talking perceptions here only. But we already talked about how it could indeed be relevant and important for qualitative researchers as well. But what about other areas of communication where you think beyond psychology that open science and open scholarship has something unique to contribute and sort of some transformative potential for the work we do? Maybe Richard, who addressed the emerging areas, has thoughts on this first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak about it, but maybe since I've already chatted a little bit, maybe somebody that hasn't spoken up already would be willing to take the lead first.
Yeah, I can say something, at least from an editor perspective. I mean, the idea of its applicability to the different areas of communication, I mean, all of these areas are in the business of wanting to generate quality knowledge. And so if you believe that open research, open science, its basic principles are about improving that quality, then it should be applicable to all these areas. Now, in terms of its facets, like how it's going to be put into practice for a humanistic researcher versus a qualitative researcher versus a quantitative social scientist, or qualitative empirical work, or what have you, that will vary. But the basic principles of what open research is about should work for anyone and everyone within the field.
Yeah, we'd like to also are operating in an environment where different methodologies have engaged to different degrees with openness as a concept and guiding principle. So as is so often the case, we may be just having sort of different levels of engagement and development still. So there may just be more work left to be done for humanistic and qualitative methodologies than for methodologies that are more closely aligned with psychological methods, or methods often applied in psychology, let's say that.
That will also, I wanted to follow up on Lindsay's point as well, though, is that, you know, a lot of what people think, if they don't think as well of alternative methodologies relative to their own, it's usually just due out of ignorance. And so what open research will allow is to show the rigor that exists for the other types of work that you may not partake in, and then you'll be able to see the added value that exists in that type of work, even though you are not doing it. So I think that that's really one of the major potential upsides of moving to an open research.
Just to follow that point, and Lindsay, I'm really glad you mentioned this notion of making rigor more visible. I mean, for anyone who is trying to explain what they did in a study, and anybody on the call or listening to us who's ever been an editor of a paper with open shared materials or been a reviewer, you just know more of what's going on. That's really all this is. It's nothing more than pulling back the curtain a little bit. The number of times as an editor and a reviewer and even an author where I've been able to point to supplemental files or extra information. Lindsay mentioned the point about, you know, when you're explaining your deep coding methods and your theoretical saturation points, you don't have space in your manuscript to fit all of that, which is why we can turn to these other ways of sharing material. So a lot of open science is really developed as an affordance of some of the technological features we have today as we publish online. But I really like this idea of, it's not a discipline specific thing. It really is the extent to which we think, or you think, that the science that you're doing or the scholarship that you're doing can benefit from removing layers. And it's hard for me to see the areas where that won't help more so than the areas that it would help. Because at the top level, it really is just unveiling a curtain. Now we should debate what those curtains should be, how thick they should be, what we should be protecting. But at the top level, right, it answers so many questions when a reviewer says, well, how come you didn't do it this way? Or I don't understand your code book, or I don't get what your saturation point is. The documents are right there, the data's right there. And of course that leads to other issues. But I like this idea that the things that we're already being robust about, it showcases those things. And it could also reveal times where somebody maybe wasn't very robust and we're reading a paper and we start to realize that the study that was described may not be the study that was conducted. So, you know, those things are really critical. And I can't see how they could be tied to one discipline or even one methodology. It just doesn't track for me.
Yeah, and I think within, whenever I talk to people about open research, open science practices in comm, a lot of times we constrain the definition of open science in a lot of ways to kind of mean either just like data dump or replications, which these are both like really great things, and they're two sharing data and replicating are two components that we talk quite a bit about in the agenda. But at the same time, the open science practices that I think have been most beneficial, at least for us within more like a lab environment, working with a bunch of younger researchers and training people to come alongside us and doing the research that we're doing, is these more infrastructure building and documentation and pulling away the sort of cult of expertise that happens in science, where we kind of just pretend that these completed studies materialized from on high and were granted to us in order to share with the world. That I think pulling away these curtains and creating the infrastructure and documentation for these studies has been really helpful for, as we've been developing younger scholars in the lab and as we've been sharing our data with others, is it's kind of the more that you share as far as the infrastructure that has to happen for a research study to happen ends up creating better training and ends up helping earlier career researchers to know what are the good things, what are the things that they should be doing, and what are the things that aren't worth their time. And when you have data to mess with, you can test questions that are interesting. And when you have packages that you're building to analyze data using well-developed pipelines, you can share these things in a way that just makes the scientific enterprise a little bit more efficient, and also opens, in a way, in sort of a different definition of the word opens the scientific enterprise to people who maybe don't have the equipment that they need to do a particular study, or they don't have the infrastructure at their university, or don't have the background to understand how to do a particular analysis. Engaging in open research practices can kind of help bring researchers alongside for the scientific process that normally wouldn't consider themselves members of the sort of elite club that's publishing in our JOCs and HCRs and these sorts of things. So I think there's all these sorts of tangential benefits of open science that aren't just dumping our data indiscriminately in a repository and like replicating other people's studies. Although these are super cool, super good components of open science, they're not the end all be all of the endeavor.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I have a question for Alice and also you, Jake, because in our series of short response videos, you sort of adopted the position of early career researchers. Not putting any pressure on you, but you're now speaking for all early career researchers in the field. There's a question that came up about particular challenges to junior scholars in their sort of maybe motivation and drive to adopt open science practices in an environment that's not yet fully amenable to them. All right, so oftentimes junior scholars won't be the ones who are pulling the longest levers in a research project and don't get to make the ultimate decisions about how studies will be planned, carried out, analyzed, or reported. So from a practical perspective of an ECR, how would you handle working in such a project in which maybe the PI is not actively trying to engage in questionable research practices, but also doesn't really adhere to the standards of good open practice or as well, and maybe even thinks of them as superfluous or somehow unnecessary? What would you suggest to a junior scholar in that position? Maybe Alice first, and then.
Sure, I think this is a really good question, and I appreciate the person bringing this up on the document. So I think this question gets us the power differences in academia. Where junior scholars and graduate students are sort of disempowered in decision making, and their voices are less heard in institutions. And I think this problem also applies to scholars of color and female scholars. So this groups of scholars, they face additional challenges in implementing open science practices when working with someone who are not into open science, but they are well positioned by social and institutional privilege. So I think this is a systematic issue, and there's no easy solution. And we just, as we have already talked about, changes in organizational culture and incentive structures are definitely critical. But I think at the same time, we need to engage some senior scholars as champions of open science in each institution, such that junior scholars have someone to talk to and back them when they encounter issues. Absolutely, there are multiple challenges, and I myself encountered some like challenges in when trying to implement managing social science. So I think having someone as a faculty champion in our institution who will speak for us would be definitely helpful. That's my 2 cents.
Well, that's a great point to make, I think. Yeah, maybe one point that's always possible to make for any ECR, I think, also is that open science and open scholarship more widely seems to be just the direction the ship is sailing towards, right? So any PI who's interested in producing research that will be widely regarded as high quality and sort of conforming to a high standard of research quality will want to engage into practicing these principles sooner rather than later, I think. So in a sense, my point of view, I'm saying this now as a discussion participant, obviously not only as a moderator, but is that really, as an ECR, you also have an obligation, maybe in your own interest, to also work as an educator of sorts. Should you be in a position where you encounter ignorance or lack of awareness about open science practices, maybe others in the in our roundtable something else to say about this, about challenges to ECRs and how, when it comes to open science and how to address them. Any ideas, Jake, maybe, or Tobias?
I think Tobias had something to say.
Yeah, I would like to add that I would like to encourage everyone to speak to their advisors or their lab managers whether it's possible to do it. And sometimes you might think that, oh, this won't be possible because it's such a big change. But oftentimes I think seniors are very open to that. But they're probably not in the position to actually carry out the work or think everything through. But I think you can always try, and it's something that I learned. When I was working together with my advisor, Sabine Trepte, at one point I asked in the project, well, why do we not pre-register our studies? And we hadn't done that before, so I thought there was some kind of threshold. But she was like, no, I'm open to that. I'm happy to work in that direction. So at least I think try it, and if it then doesn't work out, you can at least tell yourself you've tried it. But I would add that oftentimes you can actually adopt a lot of these practices.
Mm-hmm. There also might be explaining why. I think sometimes, especially for someone going through their training, you might be perceived as just jumping on the latest fad. And if you can't explain to your team why you're doing this, what you're actually doing, I think back to my graduate school days, and I was often the project manager. So in one way, like Tobias said, I'm in the prime position to form the documents, form the files, form the materials. I'm often the one creating the stimulus materials for an experiment, for example. So I could be the one sharing these things, but explaining why I want to do it. And not just pointing to JOC 2020 and saying, look, see, open science. But instead explaining the motivations behind it, explaining what you think it's going to gain for your lab, what it's going to gain for your research. Jacob and Alice made a great comment in their video about your worst co-author is you 6 months ago, because you can't go back and email that person and figure out what was in their head when you're on a paper 6 months, a year from now. And maybe it's just good lab management practice. Maybe you explain that it's a good way for you to track your progress through the program. Maybe you explain that you often find yourself talking about your materials with other scholars. And all of us have been in a situation where we wanted to find someone's scale. Something as simple as a measurement, and we can't find it. It's nowhere to be found. Even the paper where they validate the scale was published in 1983, and the appendices were too short, and so we can't find the items, right? This is a surprisingly large problem in our field. So those are ways that somebody who is in a lab management perspective or in a project manager perspective, which is often an ECR, might be able to walk through and explain the benefits of doing these things and mitigating the threats, one of them being I'll do some of the work. It's part of my project. So that sounds a bit prescriptive, but I think it's really important that anybody engaging in this, and especially an ECR engaging a supervisor or a more established scholar to explain the logic. Without that part, it won't be successful. You're either going to get a dispassionate project lead, or you're going to get resistance because you're just complicating things. You know, you're putting a fly in the ointment, and we don't understand what you're doing. So, you know, and that goes for people like myself explaining to my supervisors why I suddenly want IRB to approve my consent form to share data widely, right? We all have to make sure we explain the rationale behind some of these choices. The agenda is not as important as the reasons behind the agenda, I think. And as long as we don't lose track of that, I think we'll be successful.
Yeah, that's actually a great point to make, I think. So it also helps, I think, if you're an ECR and you may run into a situation where you're frustrated by not feeling like you're having a supervisor or PI who's very receptive to your passionate views about open science, to just be aware that for the older generations, it will take a greater amount of unlearning things. Right. I see Lance chuckling at this. Yeah. And so we need to be kind with them as well, as stupid as that may sound. But so, for example, if you pre-register your work, you automatically lose some of your ability to create the kind of beautiful narratives that only 10 years ago were considered to be a necessity for having a top-notch publication, right? Because your findings that come out of your pre-registered studies may just come out ambivalent or somehow confusing, contrary to expectations, and yet there's not much you should be able to do about this if you pre-registered. So it takes this collective process of unlearning on the in the older generations, I think, as well, which we should bear in mind when sort of before we are sort of engaging in too much frustration and maybe even outright warfare between generations when it comes to open science. Really, I don't know if you ever thought about this, Lance, as well.
Just a collective thank you. Be kind to us.
I do think Alice's point is a point that's worth emphasizing, is the idea that too often, or maybe not too often, but there's an elevated risk, I think, of open science or open research practices being used as kind of especially for early career researchers or researchers who are from disadvantaged or marginalized universities or groups. You can kind of, open research practices can be used as kind of an alternative evaluation mechanism compared to something like prestige or like how connected authors are. And I feel like there's a definite risk within any field, but within communication in particular, like we're talking about, that open research practices could be used as kind of well, if you're not at this elite university and connected to the editor of some elite journal, or have the connections or the name recognition, well, then we're going to like require all these openness practices, or like we're going to require that your pre-registrations work really well, or sort of like applying these standards in a means that's sort of inconsistent depending on the prestige levels of the authors, or their connectedness, or the eliteness of their universities, or these sorts of things, where open research practices are used as sort of just another thing that those who are already in groups that are not well connected have to do in order to show their credibility. And so I think it's something that's a conversation that's worth having, of like kind of as Nick said, the philosophy behind the agenda is this idea of openness being more of a leveling the playing field in some ways by pulling back the curtain and demystifying this sort of this idea that research is this very clean process that geniuses sit down and come up with something wonderful and it just magically materializes on paper. That kind of making the work process more transparent, but at the same time, I think making sure that these transparency criteria aren't applied in a way that just creates another thing that people who already have a lot of things have to do in order to advertise their credibility as researchers or their skills.
So if I can maybe provocatively push back just a little bit. I know this is a panel on open science and doing or open communication research and scholarship more generally, but I would just say you're both absolutely right in that there are concerns around power and prestige and marginalization. I mean, if you look at, there's dozens of empirical studies that show authorship practices where women and minority groups are less represented in flagship outlets. One of the best ways to protect that is actually making some components of the process closed. Right now, double-blind peer review is the gold standard for protecting these sort of things. In journals where double-blind peer review is applied, you actually see less bias towards researchers from non-prestigious universities, from researchers of color, from female researchers. And so I just want to say, while I generally think a push towards making lots of things open and transparent is really quite good, I would just say that one of the best ways we can actually protect this when it comes to the publication process is one mechanism organized around double-blind peer review. So
yeah, absolutely, I agree.
So this question of power differentials and just how much it is actually possible for people and necessary for people to engage in open practices leads directly into another question we got about the effort involved in open science, right? So preparing data and scripts and checking all the supplementary material, which seems to be becoming longer and longer and longer. I don't know if there's any study out already about the development of the average length of our online appendices, but I'm expecting that they've increased dramatically in words over the last couple of years. Well, these kinds of things require extra effort, not only for the authors, but also for reviewers and editors. So given that academics are notoriously busy people, would you think that just the effort, the sheer extra effort that seems to be involved in practicing open science is something that's prohibitive for some or even many? And well, who actually can do this, provocatively asking, and how can it best be done, and should it be done? Or is there some balance to be struck?
Well, I would say that this is a legitimate point, and it's something that we need to acknowledge. Of course, as Lance mentioned in the very beginning, each policy change has pros and cons, or leads to changes with different outcomes. And I would agree that doing research in a truly open way necessitates more effort. But I would say that's an effort worthwhile and good invested. So, for example, when it comes to reviewing, I mean, we are very proud as researchers of the peer review system, because that gives our work more legitimacy and more credibility, because we say others have checked it. But honestly, we don't really do this. We don't check the analyses of others. And it's actually something where you could say that, well, this needs to change, because currently we trust other researchers that their calculations were right. And I can only say that as an anecdote, when I started working in academia and we submitted our first manuscript, I asked, and where do we submit the data and the analysis files? And my advisor said, no, we don't do this. And I was like, what? But if it's wrong, do they not check it? And it was like, no, they don't. And so that's something where I agree that this necessitates more effort, but actually I'd say it's something that we should be doing. And what would it entail? It would mean that we might actually end up reviewing fewer papers and submitting fewer papers, but ideally, and I would say, papers of higher quality. And I think currently we're already in a position where I think there's a spate of papers. We can't read everything. We try to read the good stuff. And I think we all should focus on research quality and not publication quantity. And therefore, this might lead to some changes, but I prefer one good paper over 3 mediocre ones.
Lance?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges, I think, especially for junior scholars working their way through a tenure promotion process is that, yes, I mean, open research is more effortful, but there's going to have to be some discussions at the institutional level because one, there's an increasing pressure to produce more and more, but in combination with the nature of the work requiring more and more effort, that's a very difficult equation. So there needs to be some discussions at the institutional level, and this might even be something for ICA to raise in order to give some power to people to go to their institutions to say we need to have this discussion about expectations and doing quality work, what that is going to entail relative to what are increasing expectations in terms of churn-out relative to overall research production. So,
of course, sort of speaking about incentives for ECRs to engage in open science practices, journals, of course, just as any institution we're sort of operating in, have a role to play in establishing open science as a standard, right? And in some ways, I think this open science movement is also transformative moments for journals, of course, right? So I'm wondering about your perspective, Lance, as sort of editor-in-chief of a very eminent journal in communication right now, how you perceive that moment from an editor's perspective. Has it caught you off guard, or how do you perceive the moment in general? Where do you think journals will be headed vis-a-vis the open science movement that's going on?
Sure. Well, JOC is nested within ICA, and ICA treats its journals as a collective. And so the idea of instituting certain practices or certain demands relative to open research for one journal really doesn't make much sense. It has to be more at an association level. I think right now the idea of, and I'm sure that's going to be a discussion ICA will have sooner rather than later. And so with that, I think this is a good time where, we're testing things out, where we're playing around with these different practices, different people are doing in slightly different ways, and refining the nature of their techniques and their procedures, and we're encountering them. And hopefully best practices will rise up to the top over the course of time. And this is all necessary, but I think it goes along with several of the points that are being raised. I don't think we're still playing around with the nature of our storytelling as well in a digital environment. We're still working under something like page constraints in a digital environment. And the idea of, we don't want to get into a practice where you're publishing an article, but then if you look at the supplemental files and it's a book, and that's possible. The idea of what is the nature of the use of these documents and to use a digital space. And, for something like open research, the ideas of these principles have been around for a long time, but a digital environment makes it possible. And so it's not really that much different than, Luther putting 95 Theses up on the Church of Wittenberg versus having a printing press. The printing press is necessary, but not sufficient condition for challenging the power of the Catholic Church. I think this is basically the same idea. The idea of the digital environment allows us to do this, but it'll change the nature of our storytelling. And I don't think we've figured that out yet of exactly how to embrace that space.
Some of these are easier than others, right? The idea of sharing materials is not new. You can find papers from the 90s where a professor has put up a website on their personal domain and linked to a blog that has their stimulus materials. It's not super common, but if you read through, even in comm, I've seen some earlier media psychology papers where they would in fact share the materials online or put a video URL inside their published article, even when it was still, mostly paper. And sharing materials seems to be one of the easiest ones to do. We already have to have our study materials, our code books for our research. And so simply sticking those on a repository and submitting a paper for publication, the reviewers aren't confused by that. The author's not confused by that. The editor's not confused by that. And you mostly don't need a policy if it's voluntary. And you may later on decide, as Lance has said, to have a policy to where it's required, and that's a different conversation. But I think it's important for folks to realize that most of this is not new. It's not even new to this decade or this century. It's just a matter of degree and a matter of awareness and a matter of institutionalization. Sharing data gets tougher. People don't always know how to handle that. Do you share raw data? Do you share analysis data? Does your IRB allow you to do it? What is the reviewer's role in analyzing that data? Are they allowed to reanalyze it in the way that they want to? It's different from yours. And then there's a discussion over whose analysis is more accurate, right? I know when we were at Communication Research Reports, a couple of years ago, we just simply invited people to share the materials. Shared materials and shared data didn't really pose any problems. I would say in the last 3 issues, 50% of our articles had both. There's actually more people sharing data, believe it or not, than sharing materials. In part because I think they had the data right in front of them. The materials they may have had to go and actually get and clean up and things like that. Reviewers didn't seem overly concerned about it. The registration part, that seems to be the real roadblock, where you are sending in your proposed study up front. And that's one where I think the journals, and Lance could probably agree, and other folks in the call could agree, that's not as easy to implement. It fundamentally changes the relationship between the author and the reviewer and the editor. A big one, for example, is time lag. It's one thing to submit a finished manuscript in and get a decision 6 months later. It's another thing to propose a study to a journal and wait 6 months and then be told no. That's an entire academic semester for most of us. You may not have the luxury of waiting for those things. Even with pre-registration, we get a situation to where the reviewers and the authors get into a discussion, and basically the reviewers end up trying to rewrite the author's paper. And then there's always, so I've seen in my own experience that the editor has to play a larger role. Because is it right for a reviewer to tell an author, I don't like your theory, use this one? Now that happens in regular review, but in some ways your paper's already done, you have a little more weight as the author. Now you're actually essentially asking for permission to do the study. The reviewers may have a lot more power than they used to. And if you have an editor who's not very involved, all of those things can conspire to slow you down and to change your work. And so when we read through our agenda, and I hope folks think about that, some of these areas are relatively easy and may require nothing of the journal, or may only require very small things of a journal. Other ones are going to require a lot of a journal. And if anybody on the call or listening to us online has ever been a reviewer for a registered report, that is a long-term relationship. You're going to review that paper 2, 3, 4 times. The editor is going to see that paper 2, 3, 4 times at different stages. In many ways, it's like a thesis or a dissertation in terms of its structure. So, there is some differential investment and differential process change as well.
And I would also add that this is an exciting part where we probably would also, and we've already hinted at that, or you hinted at that, Eike, might see some changes in what that means epistemically for our theories. Because what would happen if we realize that a lot of our studies, if we design them, they don't get supported by the data we collect? And will this lead to more conservative studies? And I would argue, I would say that that's likely to happen. And so some might say, okay, that's bad because our research gets more boring then and not so flashy or not so coherent. And I would say, no, that's a process of a maturing science, because otherwise it might be a nice story, but it's not suited for making predictions in other contexts. And it might be a process that we as communication scholars would undergo in the upcoming years. And it could very much be that we have to tone down a little bit and get our basics absolutely right, on which we can then build in order to work toward a cumulative approach. And I'm looking forward to that, and it'll be an exciting journey, I'd say.
Well, that's a great thing to say. Before we get to a very final round of questions, I have one more that I would like us to address, because I see it coming up all the time in discussions I have with people about open science, and that's that sometimes there's an impression amongst people, I think, that open science is somehow adverse to exploratory research, right? And to finding things that are new, essentially, right? So actually harks back to what Tobias just said about a suspected conservatism within the open science movement. I think these kinds of sort of suspicions are particularly strong in within fields which rely more on qualitative methods, but not only there, but also but particularly there. So maybe Lindsay, as our representative of the the qualitative methodologies as they relate to open science, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the relationship of open science to exploration and sort of uncovering sort of new unexpected findings.
I don't see it as a problem at all, since, I mean, at the core of open science is accessibility and transparency. I think that open science practices are really about being transparent. So if you're transparent and you're designing a qualitative study and you say, I'm not sure what I'm going to uncover when I'm investigating this communication phenomenon, I think that I don't see how that would conflict with what we want to achieve through open science practices. So I don't see a conflict there, but perhaps someone else does. But
maybe have others encountered this sort of suspicion when they talked about open science? Or am I alone in this?
For me, I think it really I like this point about transparency quite a bit. Thank you, Lindsay. For me, it gets to the fundamental question between, are you doing confirmatory or exploratory hypotheses? And I think, especially when it comes to pre-registration, it forces us to face that fact very strongly. When you think about pre-registration, you are pre-registering a series of confirmatory hypotheses, and you're pre-registering an analytic plan. We are going to do X, Y, and Z steps to let us test this particular hypothesis. You need a strong theory to do that. You need a theory that actually makes a clear prediction, and not one that just makes an analogy or some sort of metaphor about what your data should look like. And I think in some ways, Lance has brought this up in some published work and also in his video. This might, in some ways, open science might force us to recognize some of the challenges we have in some of our theories, in that it's really quite difficult sometimes to know what the capital H hypothesis is. And so if that's not what you're doing, then the next step becomes theoretically informed data exploration, and theoretically informed, that's fine. You might not pre-register a specific prediction, but then you have to be a little bit more upfront about what it is that you actually did and why, and what you think it means, and the extent to which that constrains the types of claims you make. And I think that's something. If I were to say what might be one of the bigger challenges we might have to face as a field, to reviewers not familiar with or familiar with expecting hypothesis tests that really were parking, and not seeing that in papers, I think that might become a little bit bigger of a challenge that we face moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And just to extend on that, the post hoc analysis plans are still like perfectly acceptable. And one of the things that we talk about in the strict hypothetical deductive method of registration is that you're simply telling the reader, what part of the study did you plan and what part of the study did you fall into? It's okay to fall into things. Sometimes you find really neat stuff, but there's this brick wall now where we see, here's what I wanted to do. I got to doing my thing. Here's what I found. Let's move forward with this. And as Lindsay pointed out, and I really appreciate that, the transparency is not an anathema to this, right? I mean, if we're not doing careful scholarship, then what are we doing, right? And if you're just talking about making what you did transparent and rigorous, it's what we think separates scholarship and science from just piddling around, right? And so if you're making the process transparent, that means lots of different things to lots of different areas. But really, we're just trying to say, I didn't make this up. And here, let me show you versus, you know, trust me, I'm a scientist or I'm a scholar. And that shouldn't be an anathema to any sort of exploration. And it also allows us, again, to make our explorations clear in times where we didn't plan on going looking in the first place. And as Richard's pointed out, and lots of folks have pointed out, I mean, we know our field is implicitly rife with, you know, cobweb models that suddenly fit and analyses, you know, the 4 or 5 way interactions that suddenly work. And that doesn't do anything except make suggestions about unsubstantiated predictions that their data engineer their predictions, and then we can't go anywhere. We can't replicate those things, and it really slows us down in the end.
One brief addendum to that, I think our discussion parts will become much more interesting because because we really, and I've realized that when I did my first paper that was pre-registered, because some of the things we just didn't know beforehand, we just learned, and so there are new thoughts in the discussion which you normally would have written in the introduction, because you don't introduce a new theory or I don't know what, a new explanation in the discussion, but it makes everything, I think it emphasizes or makes discussions much more interesting.
We won't skip
at the same time, one of the interesting things about this sort of exploratory versus confirmatory is I think we all kind of have to acknowledge a little bit, even if it's just in like a semi-humorous ways, there's a little bit of a like prisoner's dilemma when you think about these sorts of things, because we know that I mean the state of affairs is that a lot of research sells exploratory hypothesis testing as confirmatory, and there's this idea that even if it's fully honestly motivated of, oh yeah, like this is what I would have expected all along, totally, yeah, the theory definitely predicts that, I'm going to go ahead and put that in as confirmatory. And then in the marketplace of ideas, when you have a discussion section that's kind of like, well, we don't know, or this is exploratory, or you're admitting at the front end that something is maybe not the traditional model of just being H1, H2, H3 motivated by theory one that leads to these very clear conclusions. Kind of in the marketplace of ideas, you're in it's a little bit of, like I said, a prisoner's dilemma, because you're kind of like, do I really sell, like, how much can I be transparent about this when I know that you're in the marketplace of ideas with a bunch of papers that aren't being transparent about these things? And I think a conversation as a field worth having is, it's almost like, well, if you don't do this, then I don't do this, then you don't do this. And so we kind of all have to collectively agree to be honest together in a way, which is an entirely different, I think, social norms type conversation, which is interesting to have.
I just want to add for a minute, going back to that question about exploratory research using qualitative methods. If we pre-register a qualitative study, many qualitative studies are about theory building. And so we don't always have a theory identified at the beginning of the study. So it's not so much about theory testing, but instead asking questions. Why is this happening? How is this happening? What's going on here? And so I don't see a problem with acknowledging that study design and that motivation for doing the research based on the previous literature, but also having that open-ended nature. And then in the discussion saying, these are the connections, these are the this is what we're seeing in terms of patterns in the data. So it is a much different approach from an exploratory study versus a confirmatory study, but I don't think that that is a problem for open science policies that really want to emphasize transparency.
Yeah, that's an excellent point to make, I think. I will also say that with exploratory work, as with all other areas of work we engage in, we are caught in a transformation based on our consideration of openness as a principle, really, right? And there's a lot going on in terms of adjusting our ways of doing things in this area as well. I mean, and just one example of this that just came to mind as you were discussing the question of sort of the valuing of or valorization, you could say, of exploratory work in open science is that I think in the journal Cortex, which is a cognitive neurology journal, they introduced a new publication format called exploratory reports, right? Which very much, I think, speaks to the themes that you addressed, Lindsay, where there's a rigorous transparency to an decidedly exploratory approach to analyzing data and collecting it, right? So these two things, I think we do have quite a bit of a consensus here. Don't exclude each other at all, open science and exploration. So we are over time already, but the virtual format has us, like I said earlier, being a little bit more unhinged than we would be had we been in Australia. But I do have a final question for each of you in the end. So, and maybe you can take it one after another. So, we in the agenda paper we make 7 recommendations for open science, and I was wondering, like, if there was one single of the 7 recommendations in the agenda that you could make the field of communication adopt widely right away, which one would it be? Which one would you like to see the most? Maybe Alice can start. I don't know, whoever feels ready first. But
yeah, I can start. So
yes.
I already talked about in my video with Jacob, talking about the importance of replication studies, especially for the learning purposes among graduate students and those who are still learning the basics of research. So I think having open science practices are definitely beneficial for graduate students who are still trying to learn the basic research research ideas and also the analytical procedures. And one thing that we haven't talked about is computational research, which relies on large-scale social media data. And actually lots of computational researchers in social science, they are learning from CS, computer scientists are more advanced in these approaches. So having this data available out there like serve as a learning tool and resources for early career researchers to learn from others and to contribute to the research community. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. So anyone else who has looked up our 7 points again already and feels confident to pick one of them as their top choice, and why?
I'll go ahead. My top choice is collaboration. I think that is really important for both quantitative and qualitative research, but especially for qualitative research that can be more interpretive. I think that it gives additional credibility to the research study. And there's a saying I've heard numerous times among qualitative researchers and in publications that discuss qualitative research, that when you're conducting a qualitative study, you should conduct the research as though someone is looking over your shoulder and making sure that you keep that chain of evidence and that you have other perspectives represented, not just your own perspective if you're operating from an interpretive paradigm. And so rather than just working as though someone is looking over your shoulder, I think having a group of scholars who are collaborating and looking over each other's shoulders really leads to that transparency and credibility and trustworthiness that we value in qualitative research.
That's great. Nick or anyone else?
5 has to happen. Like, you have to be trained and you have to practice this and be knowledgeable. So that almost for me is a prerequisite for anything. But the one I find myself speaking about most publicly is the first point, is that publishing more of your research. And when I say more, I don't mean more papers. I mean more of your research process. We learn so much more about the genesis of your ideas, about the scientific method, about things that we learned in graduate school that we've kind of let slip to the wayside. And we learn, again, I'm going to go back to Lindsay again and talk about, I'm just now recently learning qualitative methods. And my big critique when I was younger and ignorant was, they're too vague. I don't understand. There's no structure here. That's, of course, a complete lie. If you learn the method, there's a rich structure there. It's just that I never read it. I only saw the paragraph in a paper that said, we coded a saturation, moving on. Or, an experiment where we said, we did a pretest, it worked, moving on, right? So outside of learning it all, it's please publish more of your work. Let us see the process. And the person over your shoulder isn't there to get you. They're there to help guide it forward, right? And that's what I would like to see more of. I'd like to read more of all of my colleagues' research.
Can I just comment very quickly on what Nick said about the one paragraph in a journal article that talks about our qualitative method? One of my biggest frustrations when I was a PhD student and submitting my first articles to journals is the criticism that I would receive is that my method section was too long, because I wanted to have that transparency. I wanted to show I did this in a systematic way that someone could follow in my path and conduct a similar study. But oftentimes when you need to cut words in a qualitative article, the method section is the one that is reduced. And so that's a personal frustration of mine as someone who does conduct qualitative research, and we're not always able to show the various steps that we actually took to conduct this study.
Right.
That's great. Tobias, Richard, Jake, Lance, anyone willing to step up? Tobias, what's your choice?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. I think I'd go for pre-registration and registered reports, because I think that has will change the way we do our research in probably the most dramatic way, and I probably just think that it's more sincere, and it's just more scientific approach to what we're doing, and there are a lot of open questions to what that would lead to, but I think we can, I only benefit from that. And it also, I would make that also, that's the point what I think is really most difficult to implement. Your question was if you could change it at the end of a moment. Currently those options don't exist, and I would love them to be there. I would love to use them. And so that if I could change that, I think that would be the one.
Yeah, that's a great point about the, again, transformative potential that's sort of associated with pre-registration, rather than it just being sort of a new method or something. Like that's a great point to make. So Richard, Lance, Jake?
Sure, I'll jump in quickly. I would just say, for me, it's replication. I know that we can get into a discussion about what types of studies should replicate, and there's some deep philosophical divisions on that discussion. For me, I mean, exposing my own biases, I think science should replicate. And it's something that, unfortunately, I feel like we don't see enough in the social sciences in general, including in communication. I mean, I will say, with a big shout out, there is one a special issue organized around replication. Bree McEwen, Chris Carpenter, and David Westerman pulled this off, but to date, this is the only one in the field of communication. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done here, a lot more that can be done. And it gives us an opportunity to see, for some of these theories that we've been using now as a field for a long time, do some of the earliest and most foundational findings hold up? Or are we how good is the foundation that we're building on, and replication lets us test that. And so for me, that is something I'd hope to see much more moving forward.
Great.
I'd say for me, it's probably somewhat of a combination of 5 and 7. Probably started with 5 being skills and 7 being the incentive structure in academia. I think a lot of the open science or just open research practices in general are sort of, they're contingent upon having some certain skills. As far as like, I don't know, like managing a repository and like knowing what, you don't have to necessarily know what something like Git is, but knowing how to like version control, or knowing how to think in a way that lets you properly document version control and keep track of your research in a way. Like most people, I mean, even myself, there's not a lot, like this stuff isn't easy and it's not intuitive in a lot of ways. It's not the way that we naturally go through the research process. And thinking about the skills that have to be developed both in ourselves through like, I don't know, pre-conferences, panels like this one, or more kind of hands-on practical skills sharing of like, how do you do this stuff? How do you like version control a manuscript so you know the evolution of your thinking over time? How do you post data online? Like, what do you remove? What do you not remove? What do you like? How do you post a reproducible section of your data without compromising your participant's identity? Like these sorts of things that kind of have the infrastructural stuff that has to be done. But then at the same time, the infrastructure is not going to be done if it's not being incentivized. Like if people are building packages or sharing data and then not getting tenure, or like not getting jobs, or not like these things, the sort of necessary groundwork is required in some ways for open science to happen. And so I think the skills training of younger researchers, and then also the incentive structures of how these infrastructure projects and training and sharing are actually rewarded within the academic incentive structure.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're bringing up this pedagogical dimension to open science at the end. We didn't get to discuss it a lot right now in our discussion, but it's definitely an exceedingly important one, I think. I'll also use that point to say that we will have what I hope will be a great learning lab as part of the theme program in collaboration with FORT, the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training, which I hope to see some of you engage with if you want to. So that's an initiative that tries to promote the teaching of all the skills that you just alluded to, Jake, which Great. I hope will gain ground in our field going forward. So, Lance, do you feel in a position to pick one?
I guess just from an editor perspective, each of these 7 points all have potential value to help influence the impact of the work. So, part of our job is not just to identify and ultimately publish those pieces that are going to provide some impact on the field. We want those individual works to flourish. And so in part of the review process, we want to try to introduce those elements of the pieces that will allow that. And so, the offering of these different components, showing something that replicates, showing that you pre-registered, showing that these all can aid in showing the overall value of the piece, which will ultimately increase its impact. And so from an editor's perspective, each of these have value.
It's a great note to close on, I guess. Each of them is important, of course. I'll also use the opportunity having you on right now to mention the special issue call for papers.
Sure. So June 15th is the deadline for an extended abstracts. We've had some internal discussion as to whether to extend that as a result of the world that we're living in at the moment. But working with the extended abstracts, we're keeping the June 15th date in place at the moment. Part of my slides, I offered the link to it. really the focus on the three different areas of increased empirical evidence relative to the concerns that exist within the field, thinking through the potential upsides and downsides that exist of a movement toward open research and how to mitigate any potential downsides that exist. And the third component is what does this mean for qualitative and humanistic works? And what we think is of value here is that this particular field, the field of communication, is addressing this at a time when we're not in crisis. Oftentimes these practices are enacted as a result of some catastrophic event by one or more researchers, and allowing us to have a quality discussion here and to implement these practices potentially in a time when nobody's calm at the moment, but calm epistemologically. And so we think that that's important, and we wanted to have a role to play, and we're very excited to have some small part to play in this ongoing discussion.
I guess I can speak for all authors of the agenda that we're exceedingly happy to see this special issue come about, and this conversation we're having at ICA 2020 be carried on through the special issue. I think we're at the end of the discussion. There would be, of course, many more questions to discuss, but we're over time already, so we'll leave it at that. I want to thank all of you for this very pleasurable discussion with you. Thanks for linking in and having that conversation with us. I hope to see many of you during the next weeks during ICA, and then, of course, going forward as we are continuing our open science discussion. Thanks very much for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And see you later.
Bye.
Bye.